Welcome to America's Public Forum, Braver Angels' flagship speaker series in the nation's capital, exploring questions of division and unity, ideology and identity, faith and faction, and the philosophical implications of depolarization work, with help from the most thoughtful analysts and activists across the field. Across the country, our citizen leaders believe and practice an ethos of unconditional goodwill across all divides, cultural, social, and political, to help Americans across every walk of life find value in each other no matter what. Here in D.C., where the stakes of power are high and the questions of meaning are historic, we do exactly the same thing with our friends in scholarship, journalism, activism, advocacy, and public service in every nook across the ideological spectrum, for we cannot expect a more thoughtful public discourse unless we practice it ourselves. We only ask hard questions, and we don't always come to firm conclusions. Our goal is only ever to think a little clearer about the problems of nationhood and union in 1,000 different ways, and that's why we're here tonight. My name is Luke Nathan Phillips, and I work for Braver Angels here in D.C. I am very pleased to present this event alongside our partners in the Hertog Foundation, who do excellent work helping recent graduates and young professionals from around the country learn the ways of Washington, D.C., while also carrying along the great intellectual and philosophical traditions of our civilization. Once upon a time, I myself was one of those recent graduates, and I have been grateful of serious thinkers holding mutually irreconcilable views, and the process of weaving out of those debates serious narratives capable of standing athwart politics yelling "think," a process once perfected by William F. Buckley Jr. at National Review, has been a great standard for all conservative intellectuals. One of our speakers today edits a magazine founded by Russell Kirk. Our other speaker edits the successor to a magazine founded by Irving Kristol. Conservatives have been pondering how to pull truth out of the chaos of politics and also win and govern well for many decades. And I'd like to believe those lessons for all Americans to learn from that fundamentally deliberative process. We are joined tonight by Yuval Levin, Editor-in-Chief of National Affairs, a quarterly journal of domestic policy and political thought. And he also serves as the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Yuval, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Daniel McCarthy, Editor-in-Chief of Modern Age, a quarterly review of culture, politics, and books. He also serves as Vice President for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Dan, thank you for being here with us too.
Thanks.
So welcome to everybody joining us from the Braver Angels community and the Hertog Foundation's alumni network, and from the other spots around the conservative world here in Washington, D.C. And welcome as well to all of our guests joining us from around the country online. I am excited about how we're going to proceed with this conversation tonight. But the first thing that I would just like to note is that Dan and Yuval have spent a lot of time being in some ways a kind of intellectual diplomat and coalition manager in different sides of the conservative intellectual movement. Modern Age and National Affairs are things which attract slightly different crowds, but they open these things at an interesting level of depth that's relevant not only to conservative intellectual work, but also to a lot of conservative policy discussions. And so I'd like to give each of them just a couple minutes apiece to talk about their experiences with that and how that influences their thinking on the right. Yuval, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Luke. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the invitation to be part of this conversation. And all of you here, I'm grateful to the Hertog Foundation too, which does fantastic work. I get to teach wonderful students every summer that they bring together, and I'm always struck by the quality of the students, the level of interest, the kind of the kind of syllabus they're able to work through over a summer, and I'm just enormously grateful that this exists. I wish it existed when I was a student. And I'm grateful to be here with Dan, who I've known Dan for a long time, and I would say he really stands out for me as an example of an honest thinker in a moment that makes it very, very hard to think clearly in American political life. Lots has changed over the years that I've known him, and Dan has not changed. He knows what he believes. He knows why. His reasons run deep. He is a learned person who grounds his beliefs in philosophy and in literature and in a sense of the importance of culture. I think it's a real model. And as Luke says, he's also a kind of coalition builder. And in a sense, a diplomat. I don't know if you call yourself a diplomat, Dan, but he really does open a broad tent, even as his own views are very clear and priorities are very clear. I've gotten to write for Modern Age myself, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do that. I think Dan's really an example of how to think together to try to build coalitions, also being very clear about what matters most and what boundaries are of what we can agree on. I do think, Luke, that there's a way that a small magazine can function as a kind of organizer and unifier of intellectual work that way, and that there can be ways in which the various small magazines of the intellectual movement of the right can show the breadth of the tent while also creating some useful tensions. I think in some ways the secret to that is that the small intellectual magazine exists as much in the service of its writers as of its readers. It is often an outpost of thinking that allows writers and potential writers to kind of discover a home for themselves, a community they want to belong to. I've always thought of running a magazine as an act of community building, and in a sense, up to a point, readers are really something that we offer our writers. They're one of the things we offer writers. And writers want readers. They also want other things. They want an intellectual community. They want a sense that they have a chance to be influential. They want to be part of a larger conversation. And I think the small intellectual magazines that the right tends to be pretty good at can offer that in a way that takes communities of thought seriously and that creates room for them as ways of thinking about the passing waves of events that can allow us to slow down a little, think about what we want, think about what's going right and wrong, and have some priorities that go beyond the immediate political moment. I think Modern Age has done that fantastically well for a very long time. We certainly strive to do it too at National Affairs. And I think part of the service it provides is to clarify differences, and part of the service it provides is to facilitate coalition building, both of which are enormously important now. One last thing I'd say is I think it's coalition building that we're especially bad at now in American politics, not just on the right, but in general. To think in terms of the need to broaden our appeal, to understand that before we can do anything, we need to build a coalition so that we can actually win elections, win majorities, sustain those, and achieve something in politics. It seems to me that we've all forgotten that. We forget it all the time. And we behave now as though coalition building doesn't matter anymore, when in fact it matters more than ever. And the extent to which we've gotten bad at coalition building, I think, explains some of the dysfunctions of the moment we're living in. And it's a set of skills we have to relearn. Agreeing up to a point so that we can get something done, even as we disagree on other things, is just how politics works in a free society. And I do think we need to remind ourselves of that all the time.
And as a brief follow-up before we go to Dan, how would you define or how would you describe, Yuval, the intellectual coalition that is the community around National Affairs up to this point?
Yeah. Well, so National Affairs came out of what I think of as the second of three waves of the right trying to orient itself in the post-Cold War world. The Cold War gave shape, gave structure to the right for a very long time. At the end of the Cold War, there was and there remains in some ways real confusion about what the right should be for, how it should be organized, what its purpose ought to be in American political life. I think there have been three waves that have tried to answer that question. All of them in different ways have argued, have made a counter-libertarian argument, have said it's time to overcome libertarianism. I would think of them in terms of, first, the kind of George W. Bush wave. It's hard to recognize now, but George W. Bush ran as an anti-libertarian in 2000. That was his view. That was his self-understanding. As a social conservative who thought it was time to moderate the right's market orientation in favor of the social traditionalism. 9/11 happened, a lot of other things happened, and the Bush presidency became a kind of foreign policy presidency, which, at least in my view, was fairly disconnected from the kind of message Bush ran on in 2000. The second wave, the second attempt, was an Obama years attempt, which part got its orientation from the work of a kind of reform conservative crowd that I was part of, a very small group on the right, that tried to orient the right in the needs of, oriented more in the needs of working and middle class people. It was more populist. That was not populist, I think, fundamentally. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. And was attempted to be a response to the hyper technocratic feel of the Obama years. In that sense, it grounded itself naturally in the original neoconservatism of the right's fight against the Great Society. And National Affairs very much came out of that moment. I started in 2009. It tried to be a home for that kind of work. And I would say that reform conservative moment probably reached its peak and fell pretty quickly toward the end of the Obama years. Its peak was probably about 2014. We put out a little book called Room to Grow in that year. The third wave has been Trumpism, which I think has also tried to be an anti-libertarian social conservatism, as the reform conservatives were, as Bush was, but obviously has a much more kind of populist flavor. It has its own problems, among them Trump, I think, but it's better connected to the political mood of the right than either of the first two waves were, it seems to me. Those first two failed. I think Trumpism is in the process of also failing, but all have failed in ways that have left some lessons behind, and I think the right is still trying to figure out where it is in the post-Cold War world. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. It's not been a great time. I think the left has had a similar kind of multi-decade identity crisis. But National Affairs, it's different than it was in 2009, but it is still oriented in the sense that what we're missing is a middle-class coalition, a coalition that has a middle and working-class flavor, but that is oriented to governing. And so in that sense is on the border between populism and institutionalism. I think that's still largely its flavor, and frankly, I think that's still the way forward. And the magazine has built up a little community around itself in those terms.
I will look forward to exploring this further, but thank you for that setting here. Dan, same questions to you. Number one, what insights do you have on having been, if not a diplomat, then a kind of intellectual organizer and coalition manager? And number two, how would you define the community and the coalition which Modern Age and that network of publications has?
All right. Well, thank you, Luke. I am very grateful, of course, to the Hertog Foundation for having us here this afternoon, this evening, in fact, as well as to Braver Angels for organizing this panel. And I should also thank Yuval for his very generous and kind words about my work and Modern Age. They are reciprocated, because I think Yuval is, one of the top, 3 or 4 leading intellectual lights of American conservatism. That's true of the areas where I agree with him, and it's also true of the areas where I disagree with him. I always know that if I read Yuval, I'm going to get something that is well thought through, and that will be either an amplification of something that I already had an intimation about but had not seen articulated, or that I'll see something which will be challenging to my own views. And in fact, already Yuval has put down a number of markers or a number of issues which I think will be fruitful to get into as the conversation continues, especially about the relationship between libertarianism and different waves of the right over the last 20-odd years. So we at Modern Age, first of all, have just launched a brand new website, modernagejournal.com, which has brought us into the 21st century with new daily content every weekday. Our roots, however, and in fact, still, our backbone is a print magazine which was founded in 1957 by Russell Kirk and Henry Regnery. It's a quarterly, and it continues to be published to this day. We have copies, in fact, in this room in the back, I believe, for folks who'd like to have one. Modern Age was started in 1957 as a place to express conservative philosophy, conservative theory, conservative engagement with culture, in an ongoing way. So not just a one-off book such as Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, but rather a continuing conversation and dinner party of sorts of the best minds on the American right, looking into questions of fundamental conservative philosophy, the question of how conservatism interacts with a nation that was founded in a revolution, the different mansions within the conservative house, or the house on the right, you might say, and also what it means to have a conservatism that may be engaged in rivalry, in some cases in a kind of intellectual combat, and certainly a partisan combat with progressivism and with various other tendencies in American life. So you had a number of other conservative publications that were started in a similar time, such as National Review, which was founded in 1955. National Review had primarily a political focus, and while they did have wonderful, brilliant conservative theorists contributing to their pages, including Russell Kirk, there were certain editors, in fact, certain editors whom I admire a great deal, such as James Burnham, who were a little bit reluctant to publish, for example, Richard Weaver talking about William of Ockham and nominalism and other philosophical topics which didn't quite seem timely enough for the pages of National Review. So Modern Age was a place to have those kinds of conversations about philosophy itself and about things that are less directly connected to politics than one would find in the pages of National Review, for example. Over the course of the last 60 years, there have been a panoply of conservative publications that have sprung up. Most of these have been rather specialized. So I think National Interest, for example, National Affairs, is outstanding as a policy journal. It is not just a policy journal. It has book reviews. It also looks at philosophical issues. But I think you all would agree that policy is a primary focus of National Affairs. You've had journals such as First Things, which are conservative, but specifically on the religious side of conservatism. And if you wanted to write about things that don't really reflect upon religion, First Things would not really be the appropriate place to go for that. But Modern Age might be. And you have a number of publications which represent different schools of thought on the American right. Modern Age, on the other hand, is conservatism without an adjective, one might say. It is for the mainstream of conservative thinking, which, as Luke has alluded to, is in fact something that's disputed. There are many different people who would contend for this is, the true interpretation of Edmund Burke. This is the true interpretation of the American Revolution. And so Modern Age, in fact, is a place of convening discussion. And we have, representatives on a quite regular basis of these different schools of thought coming together in our pages, debating and disputing, not just conservatism, but all of the, sort of deep questions that connect to conservatism. So, for example, our pages have been host to a number of ongoing debates and discussions between libertarians and traditionalists. So you would find Murray Rothbard or Ludwig von Mises or others, raising criticisms of not just Russell Kirk, who was a traditionalist conservative, but even of Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was the National Review senior editor who wanted to bring together and show a common genealogy to conservatism and libertarianism. And so Kirk Frank Meyer has had his admirers within the pages of Modern Age and also his critics. And Modern Age was a place where they could all come together and debate both what they were saying and articulate and refine what they were saying, but also find contrary arguments that would help to kind of sharpen their views and to sharpen these definitions in this sense of we do have to make some concrete choices about the direction in which we want to go as Americans, as conservatives, and as persons, human beings with a commitment to what is good and what is transcendent. So that's traditionally what Modern Age has been about. Today, I think there's an even greater need than ever before for what Modern Age is doing, because you do have this populist movement on the right, strongly associated with Donald Trump. You have a number of very brash young thinkers, or in some cases, thinkers who are not so young, who have come forth and attached to themselves labels such as post-liberal or new right. And oftentimes, you're getting very important, in some ways, intellectually entrepreneurial developments from these different schools of thought. But oftentimes they are rather sectarian as well. They are a little bit cloistered. They're thinking in terms of their own small communities that they are in conversations with, and not in terms either of a larger, both temporally, historically conservative movement, and also a larger coalition of a conservative movement. So Modern Age and the kind of traditionalism that we focus on is that broad tent and does help to bring together these different elements and to make them have the conversations that, left to their own devices, might instead be monologues rather than discourses. there's a need for showing that populism, which may seem like just an angry reaction to a leadership class in this country that perhaps people feel alienated from, that populism in fact can have an intellectual articulation. And so in my own writing in the pages of Modern Age and elsewhere on thinkers such as Wilmore Kendall, for example, have tried to show the extent to which not only does populism have an intellectual articulation that can be quite respectable, but in fact this kind of articulation has roots that go back, with Wilmore Kendall, for example, to the very earliest days of the post-war American conservative movement, and before that as well. So articulating these and bringing together articulating conservatism in the 21st century, in this populist era, bringing together these different, factions and schools of thought, and generally showing that, there is a great intellectual adventure to be had by not just pursuing conservatism, but pursuing all of the philosophies that are not the sort of dull, monotonous leftism that I think we've all become inured to. That in fact there is, a great adventure to be had in the pages of a journal like Modern Age and in the pages of the books written by its thinkers. And I see ourselves as being, having a division of labor with other publications such as National Affairs. There is a need for policy journals, especially policy journals such as National Affairs, which take very concrete views oftentimes of specific, tax policies or other things that need to be crafted and pursued by politicians. And then in our case, we are a reflective publication, less concerned about direct policy, although we do talk about it, but more concerned about the overall trajectory of our nation and our civilization.
I think this goes into an interesting way to move this conversation forward then, because the question of the management of conflicts inside the readership and writership of your publications, but also in the right more generally, is something that Modern Age and National Affairs do fascinatingly well. And I'm wondering what you two, as kind of figures inside both of those figures inside the conservative discourse, think about two of the main spectrums of conflict that we see playing out pretty straightforwardly in the popular discourse, but also things that Dan, as you mentioned, have really, really interesting framings in the intellectual discourse. And conceding first, of course, that these are things that are probably resolvable in some great right-wing Hegelian dialectic that Francis Fukuyama could give us. It seems that there's one big spectrum of conflict between libertarians and traditionalists, or market types and social issues types, in the right that is meaningfully different in the post-Trump era than it has been in previous iterations of even the post-Cold War. That's one spectrum. And then there's the spectrum that Matthew Continetti argues is the key one, the one between the institutionalist establishment of conservatism and the populist wings of conservatism. And those are two spectrums that sometimes overlap, but do not necessarily overlap, So I'm curious what you two think about how those conflicts bubble up, and what directions you think they are moving the party, and not just the party, but the readers of small policy journals that are great adventures in themselves, how you think that those conflicts are shaping conservatism these days. And Dan, you can go first, or Yuval, you can go first, whichever is better by me.
Would you like to?
Sure. I think that, well, first of all, I think the management of these is the wrong way to think about it. We're not killing each other. We're having an argument, and the best way to have that is to have it. So I think that within reason, it makes sense to be a venue for voices that differ with each other on these questions. We try to do that. If you look at our last issue, the winter issue that's in the back now, there's a piece there by two libertarian writers called Against Nationalism. A piece I don't particularly agree with myself, but that I thought was important and smart and valuable. In our next issue, which will be out on Thursday, online on Thursday of this week, we have a piece by Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, making a case for a certain way of understanding industrial policy, which is entirely at odds with that piece that we ran in the last issue, and which I think is well argued and a thoughtful piece. And those both belong in our pages because they're a serious argument about a practical question where people have to work out what they think by making the best case they can and seeing what kind of influence they can have on the public debate. I think that's the way to think about both of the issues that you raised. I would also say in general, I think that in the immediate post-Cold War years, the right became too libertarian, too attached to market economics and not sufficiently grounded in traditionalism, in social and cultural conservatism. There is a tension between market economics and traditionalism. It's not, I think, an irreconcilable tension in practice. It's a tension we reconcile all the time. I think in some ways, the life of our civilization for the last 3 centuries has been a reconciling of this back and forth. But reconciling doesn't mean finding a perfect medium and then living there forever. It means pulling and pushing and tugging at each other and trying to find a livable way to address practical problems. And so I do think the right was for a time much too libertarian, and that required a response. As I said, I think I think effective political movements within the right have presented themselves as that response for 30 years. Some have been a more effective response than others, and we're still trying to find a persuasive, effective response. I think that kind of response would understand the value of market mechanisms as means, but would not allow them to define ends. And that's a much neater thing to say than to do. It's not a simple matter, but I think it is important to remind our friends on the right, my own colleagues sometimes at AEI, that of just the simple truth that man does not live by bread alone. That even though something could advance growth in the abstract, it might be bad for society. And we have responsibilities to more than economic growth. I do think that the most effective mechanism for growth is the market economy, but that's not the most effective mechanism for human flourishing, not by itself. And so finding that balance in individual moments and arenas and around particular policy challenges is a lot of what the right has had to do in recent years. And, you know, I think that does require debate. I think it does require pushing and pulling. I think a lot of it has been overly simplistic in these 30 years. And, you know, are you for or against industrial policy is not a question that you can answer in a meaningful way. You know, my answer is yes, I'm for and against industrial policy. Now, let's think about what are we talking about in particular? I think that's part of what the challenge entails, is getting into the details sometimes. Sometimes it requires instead broadening and deepening and thinking about the underlying philosophical question. The question of populism and elitism or institutionalism or whatever you want to oppose to it, I think in some ways populism and elitism are both meant as insults, but are not necessarily received that way. And you know, the American right has always been a tug of war between populism and institutionalism or elitism. In some ways, the American left has been too. I think there's a lot to be said about that. Maybe we talk it through, but in the way that I think about it, well, let me put it this way. Let me commit just a little bit of political theory and then get to your question. I think that modern liberal democratic politics has been divided along 2 axes from the beginning, from, say, the 18th century. One of which we think of as the left-right axis. Sometimes that's a useful way to think about it, sometimes not. The other I would describe more in terms of an insider-outsider axis. The left-right axis usually divides our parties, a party of progress and a party of tradition or conservation. The insider-outsider axis runs internally within both of those parties. And it divides populists from elitists, or you might say insiders from outsiders. You know, there are other ways to think about that. But ultimately, I actually think about it in terms of the older political division, the classical political division between the few and the many. It's a much more fundamental layer of politics than the left-right division describes. And if our guide to left and right is Edmund Burke, I think our guide to the many and the few is Aristotle. And the way in which he offers guidance, you know, in the politics, maybe book 4 of the politics is the place to look, is to argue that the balance between the few and the many has to be reached by appealing to the middle class. Aristotle is very materialistic about it. I think that's basically still right. And that within the right, the fight between what we think of as populism and elitism is a fight for the middle class. It can ultimately only really be won or lost by whether you can make yourself appealing and attractive to the middle class. There are times when we are too populist, and to appeal to the middle class requires a kind of institutionalism, a kind of stability. There are times when we're too elitist, and to appeal to that middle class requires punishing the elites, which is what populism does well, and it's essential. And a lot of times the question for the right is, which time are we in? Do we need to be more elitist or more populist? That's a debate that's been going on in the American right for as long as there's been an American right and before. So I don't think that's going away. It's an essential argument, and it's absolutely critical to understanding this moment in American politics.
I'll be curious what Dan thinks on a couple key parts of that, but I want to see what you think first of all on something specific, and this doesn't have to be a long thing. I'm just curious. There's a kind of Burkean counter-revolutionary Benjamin Disraeli orientation that says if you can just get the policy right, if you can just address the revolutionary concerns before they cause society to explode, it's possible to prevent revolution from happening. And I've seen that argument made a couple times in the context of the 2016 election, saying, well, if only we had listened to the Reformicons and gotten the right mix of market policy plus state industrial policy in a way that fixes things for the middle class, then we could have precluded the fundamental destabilizing tinders that created the phenomena of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and shook up the American political system on that front, which seems to me to be a very prudential, maybe Aristotelian, but definitely people would call it a Burkean take these days. And I'm wondering if you think that one of the purposes of institutionalist thinking in that sense is to preclude the conditions that populist movements arise in.
Well, the Reformicons are like my closest friends.
You guys are great, by the way.
I don't think just listening to them in 2014 would have changed things very much. The tone with which we approached the right in the country did not suit the mood in which the country rightly was by then, in retrospect. And so I don't think that we were critical enough of the American elite to appeal to voters. I mean, voters were smarter than we were about that. And so I wouldn't say that. I think there's a lot to learn from that moment, and I do think that ultimately, an appeal to the priorities of working families that is also geared to governing, and so takes seriously the need for stability and for calm and for more effective government and public policy is a way forward. But that's just going to be more populist than the Reformicons circa 2014, than myself circa 2014. I'm not going to lead a public movement. That's just not what I'm destined to do. Right. And so
we would all follow you, just so you know.
Offer ideas. And I think in general, by the way, intellectuals in politics need to understand our limits. And among those limits is that we probably don't understand the public nearly as well as people who have faced the public at election time. We should not imagine otherwise. Our work is to help them. If we thought we could do better, we should run for office. We're not going to do better from a think tank. So I think we have to understand the division of labor in politics, and we can offer ideas, but I don't think we can set the tone of American political life. And I think you have to perceive that tone and be open to it and understand that in a democratic republic, the voting public probably isn't wrong about its own circumstances. And so isn't wrong to be in the mood it's in. Trying to argue people out of the mood they're in is a fool's errand in politics, and with good reason. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from that moment. There's a lot to be drawn out of it, out of the work that I and others were doing then and are doing now. But the direction to be set has to be set by somebody with political talent. That's the only way you can answer the public's desire.
Dan, same question to you on the spectrums of the market and the society and of institutionalism and populism as conflicts being negotiated these days.
Well, there's a lot on the table, not just water. So if I fail to address one of the points that you've raised or that Yuval had brought up, remind me, just nudge me, and I'll get back to it. I will say that I'm glad that Yuval framed his first remarks in terms of what's been happening in the last 20 years, and the idea that one of the things we're doing is we're looking for what the post-war conservative idea is, and I dissent a little bit from Yuval's description of the excessive libertarianism of the 1990s. That was an element, but it's the curious thing about America, and especially about conservative movements, is that you almost always get a combination of two things that are simultaneously pulling in opposite directions. So the 1990s were, on the one hand, the decade of the internet, the decade of the telecom revolution, which was a very libertarian time. And we see a lot of the consequences of that today, in fact, socially speaking. But it was also the high tide of the Christian right. And that led to the very successful Republican takeover of Congress in 1994. It actually set the stage for George W. Bush to become president. And as you've all said, George W. Bush was an anti-libertarian president. Not only was he anti-libertarian, but he was actually kind of anti-right wing. So the whole point of compassionate conservatism was that ordinary conservatism was heartless. Ordinary conservatism, if not heartless, it was alienated from natural human sympathies. Whereas compassionate conservatism was going to be a little bit more easygoing. It was going to be more well-rounded, and in that case, it was kind of going to distance itself from people who were too on the right or who were too flinty. And another thing I should point out, while Yuval's right to point to the Cold War as being, an era that was definitive for so much of what we think of as American conservatism, it wasn't the fons et origo of everything. And in fact, the very first issue of Modern Age, which was published in 1957, carried an essay by Felix Morley, who was basically a libertarian, a classical liberal, conservative in many ways, but fundamentally philosophically, a classical liberal. His essay in the first issue of Modern Age in 1957 was called American Republic or American Empire. And it was inspired by the thinking of people like Senator Robert Taft from Ohio, who were Republicans. In fact, Senator Taft was known as Mr. Republican. He was the leading conservative in the United States Congress of his time. And yet Taft was a critic of NATO. He was a critic of the Cold War as it was being waged by the Truman administration and then ultimately later by the Eisenhower administration as well. So there were interesting questions, fundamental questions about American society in the wake of World War II, in fact, and even looking back before that, about are we are we losing sight of the transcendent because we are focused on utilitarian questions? This was something that certainly many traditionalist conservatives were very concerned about. It's something that was not a matter of indifference to libertarians. Libertarians, there is I think it's fair to say that there is a main line within libertarianism which tends to be very strongly utilitarian. But you saw a number of interesting libertarian thinkers, in the Cold War period and before and after, who tried to go beyond the limits of utilitarianism. So while someone like Ludwig von Mises, for example, was a utilitarian, his disciple Murray Rothbard started to rediscover natural law. And Rothbard's very interesting. In fact, in many respects, Rothbard was quite critical of Leo Strauss, but he was very intrigued by the fact that Leo Strauss was rediscovering natural right. And Rothbard was also very intrigued by the Catholic intellectual tradition, particularly the Thomistic tradition of natural law. Now, in bringing up this, sort of complicated background to American conservatism, not just over the last 30 years, but in fact the last 60 or 60 plus years, one thing I want to, highlight is that even among libertarians, one wants to avoid caricature. And I think Yuval was quite right to, raise the risks of resorting to sort of one-dimensional, straw men of, different philosophies that you may be in contact with. There are, a wide variety of individual libertarian thinkers with quite distinct worldviews, quite distinct philosophical roots, and quite distinct applications of their ideas, just as there are with conservatives. So it's important to have, I think, in a place where you can have their own voice and a chance for them to present their views in the most articulate, best possible way. I mean, Stephanie Slade is in the audience tonight. She, has published in the Pages of Modern Age. Samuel Gregg, who's at the he's at AIER now. He also has been in our pages. But we want to avoid the stereotypes. We also want to be aware of this irony that, each phase of the right over the last 30 years has been a mixture of both new social conservative elements and new libertarian elements. I think you got that with the combination of the internet and Christian conservatism, evangelical conservatism in the 1990s. In the George W. Bush years, even though George W. Bush was very critical even of most older forms of conservatives, George W. Bush was also a guy who wanted to create what he called the Opportunity Society. And that included, incentives for people to buy homes and other things, and this was combined with tax cuts that George W. Bush also pursued. You had a mixture of things. It wasn't simply all either anti-libertarian or libertarian. And similarly with Donald Trump, I think there is a case to be made. It's perhaps not the right occasion to make it right now, but there's a case to be made that Donald Trump was actually a very libertarian president. And certainly libertarians who were very critical of U.S. foreign policy found much to like about the fact that Donald Trump didn't start any new large foreign conflicts during his 4 years. There's also, the fact that Donald Trump's own, economic background, as an entrepreneur, as a showman, his, obviously his personal life, all these things don't really match up with the idea of a stern moral exemplar, going to lead the right to some new, sort of regime of virtue. So there too, in the Trump years, you also had a mixture. In the Obama years, you had reform conservatism with Yuval and his friends at the same time as you had the Tea Party, which was libertarian. And of course, some of the people who are now, seen as being exemplars of anti-libertarian views, such as Senator Rubio, they were elected in the Obama years as paragons of the Tea Party. And that was true of Rubio, it was true of Ted Cruz, a number of others as well. Now, people evolve, they change. And in fact, the circumstances around us change as well. So I think we have to have this ongoing interaction and dialogue between conservatives of various stripes and libertarians of various stripes. And this dialogue is never going to be fully resolved, in part because there is so much diversity and variety to the serious thinkers on both sides of that spectrum. Now, speaking to populism, elitism, and institutionalism, I largely concur with what Yuval has said, especially what he said, and I think in his last set of remarks. It's not simply a matter of, if only Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan had adopted, tariffs or something, that they therefore would have succeeded in 2012, or that if Jeb Bush had that kind of program, then he would have been the nominee in 2016 rather than Donald Trump. Because in addition to policy, it's also important to have this emotional connection with voters, and it requires. I mean, it's artistry. It's like being a musician. You have to know how the audience is responding. You have to know what it is, not just the immediate market signal that you're getting from an audience, not just, oh, here's how they voted last time, therefore they're going to vote the same way the next time. You have to instead pick up on the subtle cues, which an entrepreneur in economics certainly has to do, of the things that people want, but they don't know yet that they want them. And if you can do that, if you can have that kind of creative talent, and if you can, sort of take the, market niches that other people have left unexplored and unexploited, you can become a very, quick political phenomenon. And Donald Trump certainly did that. Donald Trump picked up on all of these cues, which should have been apparent to people, for more than 20 years already. You had a series of populist eruptions in American politics right as soon as the Cold War ends. Cold War ends, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. Obviously, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. So 1992 is already a post-Cold War election. And 1992 is a year in which Pat Buchanan, running as a populist social conservative, challenges George H.W. Bush in the Republican primaries. And then it's a year in which, in the general election, you have Ross Perot running as a kind of populist, a guy who's a critic of NAFTA, a critic of immigration. Perot also has interesting quasi-populist views on foreign policy, not so much on war and peace, but Perot really believed that there were American POWs left behind in Vietnam. And that was something where, his talking about that connected with a lot of Americans who, whether or not they actually believed there were Vietnam POWs left over, they thought that America had betrayed its troops and that America had, a stain on its conscience from the Vietnam War, not just because of the brutality of the war, but because of the way we treated our own servicemen. Now, what's interesting to me, and I think, Yuval and I are pretty close in age. When I was in high school in the 1990s, we were, taught that there was this example from the progressive era where if you had a third party candidate, if you had someone like Theodore Roosevelt running as a progressive party candidate, what this would do is it would lead the major parties to assimilate the important parts of the program from the third party challenger. And it was always kind of understood that this also applied within primary challenges inside the parties. So if you were being challenged by a social conservative, that was kind of a signal, if you were in office, you were an incumbent, that maybe the next time you ran for office, if you defeated your challenger this time, you needed to tack a little more in the direction of social conservatism. You needed to listen to the signals you were getting from these, either third-party challengers or primary challengers. Interestingly enough, even though this is what we were taught as kind of the gospel within high school civics class, it was not actually being put into use. It was not actually effective or made use of by the political leadership of the 1990s and the subsequent decade. So, we had a sequence of, Republican nominees, for example, who didn't seem to internalize any lesson from the challenge they were getting from Pat Buchanan or from Ross Perot, or later on from Ron Paul, for example. And Ron Paul is interesting, for reasons that are too complex to get into here. He was certainly a libertarian, but he was a libertarian who had many points of crossover with a populist like Pat Buchanan. So you basically had an American elite, and this included America's institutions, not just the individuals, but the places, the think tanks, the magazines, the political parties that they were running, that were non-adaptive. Weirdly enough, they refused to listen to the message that they were receiving not from a majority of voters, but from a significant minority, a significant discontented portion. By the way, this is also true we're talking about conservatism tonight, but you could also have this discussion about Ralph Nader and the Democrats. You could have this conversation maybe about Paul Tsongas in 1992. There are definitely democratic parallels to the discussion that we're having here about the right. But basically, the Republican Party and the think tanks in Washington, D.C. that were conservative, and the major magazines of American conservatism, they shut their doors on these critics and these, people like Perot and Buchanan, and those who thought that Perot and Buchanan had some legitimate points. And you actually had, instead of accommodating these critical perspectives or trying to figure out why people are thinking these things, why they have this discontent with the idea that we're going to continue to have a massive international commitment after the end of the Cold War, after the end of the reason we built NATO in the first place. People who are critical of, free trade agreements and, very generous, if not open borders, then certainly, in a policy of accommodating mass immigration. If we were going to ignore the signal that was coming from the likes of Perot and Buchanan, what the leadership of the Republican Party, what the think tanks in Washington, D.C., and what the magazines all did wasn't to learn from it was instead to not just shut their ears to the critics, but to silence them. And there was plenty of cancel culture on the American right in the 1990s and in the 2000s. It was cancel culture directed against people who were critical, for example, of the Iraq War. I knew, a vice president at a major conservative think tank here in Washington, D.C., who was called on the carpet and nearly fired simply for being unenthusiastic while George W. Bush was in the room. And this friend of mine was a fusionist, so he was unenthusiastic about Bush's anti-libertarian side. So there was this great, and this continued for as long.
Our liberal friends, just so you know, we do it too. So,
well, this cancel culture within American conservatism endured for about 20 years or more, and it only started to break down it started to break down a little bit before the advent of Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump kind of amplified it. So you had, a trickle of dissent, in various institutions. Within the think tanks, you started to have a couple of scholars who were speaking out against the, uh, George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney consensus, which was on economics, on foreign policy, on immigration, the whole shebang. You had, a trickle of dissent, and then finally Donald Trump comes along and he recognizes, wait a minute, this trickle is a sign that the dam is breaking, that there's actually this enormous body of water, this enormous body of public opinion, which I can tap into. And that's what he did. And that propelled him to the Republican nomination and then to the presidency. And now, you have, with Donald Trump having destroyed the dam or opened the floodgates, have this, flooded plain now in which we're all swimming and trying to figure out where is the current going to take us. And in a way, this is actually healthier than the excessively dammed up situation and excessively controlled and censorious conditions that endured before. That's why I'm actually quite optimistic about the present moment. I think that you can have conversations like this that are very important, which were hard to have in the year 2003, for example, at the height of the Iraq War. And so I think there's been some healthy developments here. But, and just to wrap up, I still worry that the lesson hasn't sunk in with America's leadership class, that there are still a lot of very influential people. In some cases, we're talking about very wealthy people. In other cases, we're talking about, folks who are entrenched in think tanks or other institutions or in the political parties. They will go along with, if they're Republicans, they'll go along with Donald Trump because they have to. But have they actually, asked themselves, why did Donald Trump burst on the scene in the first place? What was it that we were getting wrong back in the George W. Bush era and back in the 1990s? And so I worry that there's still this tendency for the leadership, especially in this town in Washington, D.C., to be both intellectually and also emotionally distanced and severed from a lot of American voters, including, within the Republican Party, their own voters. And it seems to me that a lot of, the hope, which, I know my friend Luke and others have, that we're going to have policies that are going to bridge the needs of the many and the, sort of brilliance and intellect of the few. But I'm a little skeptical of that because I think that, in fact, the few are still very selfish. They actually don't, and they're selfish, unfortunately, in a way that leans into their virtues excessively. And Yuval was exactly right. Intellectuals, they think of themselves as benevolent, and they think that their benevolence lies in their brilliance, and that their brilliance allows them to solve other people's problems. But other people are not problems to be solved, and other people, are not just looking for more money. They're not just looking for, this or that thing that government can give them or that the market can give them. They're actually looking for a worldview, a set of emotional connections, which DC intellectuals are often very bad at even understanding, let alone creating or pursuing. Whereas someone like Donald Trump, he clearly is America's it. I mean, he understands passions in a way that is non-pareil, for good and for bad. I mean, I think that's he is a phenomenon. So emotional intelligence is something that I think our elite needs if it's going to moderate this currently, sort of the choppy seas in which we are all, afloat. And that emotional intelligence is a much harder kind of training, which I think is going to require not just philosophy and not just, economics. It's going to require literature and poetry and religion. And it's going to have to be, the kind of creation of a more well-rounded, classically well-rounded human being than our educational system right now seems to produce. And I fear that, certainly on the right, there's always a tendency to want to, simply define yourself as anti-left. And that's also not going to produce a well-rounded kind of leadership for this country.
Yeah, please.
I think it's crucially important. But maybe first about the place of public policy, because I think that it's hugely important for people who work on public policy to spend a little time in government. And it's a humbling experience because what you learn is that the role of public policy is just to finish sentences that politicians have already decided they want to start for a different reason. A good politician will start a sentence exactly where Dan suggests, in the public sense of what is right and wrong in this moment, what is needed, what there is too much of and too little of, They'll offer a kind of narrative of that resonates with voters. And then they'll say, therefore, what I'm going to do is, and then somebody like me would get a piece of paper that says, what do we fill in here? And that's what public policy is. To do that well, I think you have to have done some preparatory work, which is a lot of what the think tanks do when they do their jobs well, which is to think through the kind of technical side of public policy in ways that allow it to be effective, to achieve the goals that you set out to achieve, to be aware of some of the various kinds of outside forces that inevitably affect it, to learn from its own mistakes, to be experimental in its character. A lot of what we do in the think tanks is put things on the shelf so that when the time comes, they'll be on the shelf. Because when that time comes, whatever's on the shelf is going to go at the end of that sentence. We don't write the beginning of the sentence. We don't decide what it is. And I think that humility is crucially important because public policy is not the solution to political problems. That solution comes in the way in which politicians allow people to see that they understand their concerns, they're eager to do something about them, and then public policy comes in. Now, it matters if it works or not, and if it fails, you pay a price. But policy doesn't lead the way. And I think by seeing that, you can have the kind of humility that's required to see that you're there to provide a service to the political system, that you are not playing, you're not taking over the work of the political system. And to say, if only we'd gotten policy right in the early 2000s, this never would have happened, is almost never true. That's not how it works. But I think it's related to the second point that I want to pick up on from what Dan says, which is we're living in a period of maladaptive politics. And I think it maybe runs deeper than Dan suggested. In one sense, I do think there was some adaptation to the challenge of Ross Perot. I think that's what Newt Gingrich was doing. I worked for Newt at the end of his speakership, and he certainly thought he was doing that. It's what Bill Clinton was doing, too. They tried to take on that language of concern about the deficit and of a certain kind of worry about the direction of the country, and they felt like they did, in fact, digest some of that and turn it into effective partisan political rhetoric. But I think that in retrospect, since about the middle of the 1990s, we've been living in a period that I would not describe in terms of polarization, which is how people tend to do it, but rather in terms of deadlock. We've been living in a 50-50 politics. 50-50 politics is separate and distinct from polarization. We have two parties, they hate each other, that's polarization. You got two, they're going to hate each other. That's American politics. That's not a new story at all. What's new is we don't have a majority party. And we've now lived for an entire generation without a majority party. At almost any time before the 1990s, if you had looked in on American politics, you would have found a majority party struggling to hold a very complicated coalition together, and a minority party struggling to grow a coalition. Both of those would have been obsessed with coalition building, which is what our system is intended to make politicians obsessed with. Since the 1990s, we've had a 50-50 politics. Every election is close. Control of Congress could go either way at every election. The presidential race could go either way at every election. We've become used to that. We think that's just what it is, but it's actually pretty unusual. There's really been only one other period like this at the end of the 19th century. From the 1870s to the 1890s, it was a very ugly period, and it was shorter than the one we've already lived through. And what happens in a 50-50 politics is that nobody learns anything. The parties only learn lessons when they lose big, and nobody has lost big since 1994. You might say the one exception is Republicans lost pretty big in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. Sort of. They could easily blame the financial crisis. They managed not to learn much. I think they learned a little bit in that election. And for the most part, neither party has learned very much, which means you lose. And what you say is, well, next time we're just going to do the same thing and then we'll win. There's a very strange way to respond to a loss. But both parties have been doing this for 30 years. I mean, we're literally going to repeat the last election in the next election, running the same people, neither of whom is at all popular. Right? How do you end up in that situation? You end up in that situation because neither party is adapting. Neither party is receiving a signal from the public that says, we don't like what you're doing, do something else. And I think that happens when you win by a narrow margin and when you lose by a narrow margin. And the thing is, the parties are not wrong to think this. Republicans actually could just run the same guy they did last time who lost, and he'll win. And, just run for Congress the same way you did last time when the other party ended up with a 5-seat majority, and you'll end up with a 5-seat majority. It's totally imaginable. The trouble is that assumes that the only thing that's possible is a 5-seat majority. And I think that is dead wrong about 21st century America. It's absolutely possible to build a broad majority in contemporary American politics. I mean, if you run a middle-aged sane person, you will win 55% of the vote in a presidential election. Either party could do this. And I think neither party sees it because they're so stuck now in a 50-50 mentality that they're not learning lessons from voters telling them, we don't like what you're offering. I don't think Donald Trump has solved that problem. I think his rise is evidence of it in a sense. But I mean, it's still 50-50 elections, and the party's still running the same person over again. They're going to run for Congress in the same way over again. Maybe they'll win by a little, maybe they'll lose by a little. And the strange thing about being stuck in this situation is that it's led both parties into a kind of politics that is paralyzed by fear, that thinks if the other guy wins, the country's over. When in fact, if the other guy wins, he's got a 5-seat majority in the House. He's going to be able to do exactly nothing. This is not a dangerous time because neither party has the majority to do anything at all. And yet both of them are running as minority parties. The minority party runs by saying, we're not the other party. You don't like the other party and we're not them, right? So you run saying, I'm not Hillary Clinton. You win that way, and then you keep your promise because you're not Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden won because he's not Donald Trump. And every day he wakes up and he's still not Donald Trump, but he's doing a great job. That's really not a way to answer public concerns. And I think until a party gets a shock of losing, it will learn nothing. The first party to lose big will own the future because it will learn a lesson about the present that will allow it to then win.
So I'm going to dissent on 2 points, one of them minor and one of them major. The minor point is I would not concur that Newt Gingrich or Bill Clinton learned the right lessons from Ross Perot. Now, you didn't say right lessons. You just said that they adopted some rhetoric. That's true. Now, I would say that when Bill Clinton ran for president the first time in 1992, he did understand the need to sound like a populist. I feel your pain, that whole shtick. So Clinton was very adaptive in a sly but effective way. Not a very substantive way, but a way that did succeed in getting him elected. When he got in office, by the way, and people tend to forget this, when Clinton was in office for his first 2 years, when he had a Democratic House and Senate, he pushed as far as possible in a kind of McGovernite direction. You had the assault weapons ban, you had the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which was against pro-life protesters, and a whole panoply of gays in the military. On every front, Bill Clinton was pushing as far to the left as he possibly could. Then he was adaptive when he got rebuked, and when the voters put in a Republican Congress, Bill Clinton then triangulates, after that, gets reelected in 1996, obviously very easily. So Clinton was, adaptive in a tactical way, but he didn't really adapt the deeper themes. And the reason I point to the difference between him and Gingrich together, actually, and then Perot and Buchanan and Ralph Nader and others on the opposite side, is precisely on these issues of substance, on issues like NAFTA, for example. Gingrich and Clinton were both NAFTA guys. Buchanan and Nader and Perot were anti-NAFTA. Immigration, foreign policy, all of this, these are, it was not just, the rhetoric does matter, but, in addition to the rhetoric, the substance of the policy that you're following, especially when it's a grand policy with respect to pursuing growth at all costs through immigration, which, even now is still the primary argument that libertarians will make. Well, if you want to have growing GDP, you have to have a larger population. You're not going to get that from natural population growth. You have to have immigration. That's, the argument they still make. And it's true as far as it goes, but obviously it has some downsides. And likewise, on foreign policy, likewise on trade, Clinton and Gingrich were in a sense, the original sinners. They were the ones who set us on the course for the next, 20 plus years. And they're the ones who really, Donald Trump is the nemesis of their hubris. That's my minor objection. My major objection, your diagnosis, I surely, concur with that. We are in a 50-50, partisan condition. That is a deadlock. But I don't agree with the resolution that you see coming out of this, in part because I think I may have a different view of the reason for this deadlock and the reason for this 50-50 divide. This 50-50 divide, and the fact which you are absolutely correct to say that we do not have a majority party in this country, is because we don't have a majority in this country. We barely have something called an American people anymore. There was a time when we had an American people, which in terms of civics, in terms of religious assumptions, it was not uniform. It was never uniform. But it certainly had a sense that there was this grand narrative that we were all part of in terms of our history, in terms of it has to be stated delicately here, because this was not the kind of explicit Christian nationalism that gets promoted nowadays. You certainly had this idea of a kind of watered down Christianity, a kind of deism that could encompass by the 1950s in the famous title of Will Herberg's book,
Catholic was something that even the Schlesingers and Kennedys basically promoted as well too.
Yeah. And it's fine to say, well, this religious consensus or broad consensus was, still too narrow, that it had problems. We can argue about that later on, but there are reasons why many people were unhappy with that kind of broad consensus. The trouble is that even people who would criticize that, who would say that, well, all of these religious denominations, they were not sufficiently attentive to the concerns of sexual minorities and others, for example. Even if that was a correct observation back then, the fact is, once you weaken these common narratives that we used to subscribe to, you can't have a majority party anymore. You're just going to have these factions, which then become and there's a kind of vicious circle here, because you would think, well, okay, if you get rid of the American people as a whole, if you don't have a unified public, broadly unified public, if instead you have just everyone subscribes to their own kind of personal universe, their own personal world, or their own sort of small circle of connections, or their own internet community, which actually is a very big part of the problem today. But you might think, well, you could still have coalition-based politics. You could still stitch together all these very different people on the basis of either the goodies you're going to have government give them, or maybe the tax cuts you're going to target to them. You could do any number of, sort of policy treats that would, stitch together a coalition. But it actually doesn't work. Or if it were going to work, you'd have to have so much control over the candy store that that neither party has right now. I think the Democrats, ultimately, that's what they're aiming for. They want to have enough control over the candy store that they don't have to worry about disunity among the American public. But they're far from getting there. So instead, what you have right now is a era of entropy. And I think it's very difficult, perhaps even impossible, as long as you have an absence of an American public, to create a majority party. If you don't have a majority, you can't create a majority party. What would create a majority again? You would have to go back to education. You would have to go back to culture. You'd have to go back to the idea that we have some common ground. But there are a lot of people on both the left and the right who want to undercut the idea of a common ground. And it's not just for partisan reasons, but they have sincere and sort of conscientiously held reasons. But we're in a very bad condition here, which goes beyond the political problem, which is serious enough. And it's not like we're going to be in a Mad Max situation where people are fighting one another in the street, or I don't think much of this idea of a new civil war, any of that stuff. But we will just be unable to form effective institutions and effective majorities and democratic institutions because there's no demos.
Very unusual kind of consensus America. And by the way, I would say that America had two majority parties. If you look at presidential elections between the 50s and the 90s, you'd say, well, the Republicans are obviously the majority party. They won, what, 5 of 7 elections, 7 of 9. If you look at Congress that period, you say the Democrats are the majority party. They won everything all the time. They had 40 years of uninterrupted control of the House of Representatives. Only 6 years of that were Republicans in control of the Senate. there was an exceptional period of consensus. Now, it wasn't simple consensus. I mean, there was the civil rights movement, there were intense divisions, there was political violence to a greater degree than we have now. But I think there was a sense in which people agreed about what American politics was about. And I think that is where we now don't have a public, as you'd say. I would look here to Robert Nisbet, the great sociologist, who suggested that our politics creates the American public. The politics takes the mass of the American people and creates an organized public. And when it's working, it creates an organized public that's divided around a coherent set of questions. And generally, there is a majority and a minority in that public. I think our politics has failed to create that organized public in the 21st century. It's harder to say what our political divisions are really about. Each party would tell you that the country's biggest problem is the other party. And that's an incoherent politics. I mean, in what sense? I think there's a set of issues, and some of them have been avoided on purpose, like immigration and trade. Some of them have emerged more recently, and technology questions around that. A set of social issues that are new. They're not about abortion and sexuality, but that are around the way in which we raise our children, or the who should be in charge of culture-forming institutions. Those issues are now struggling to become the organizing questions of American political life. I think they will become that. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I'm a conservative, and I just don't have optimism. But I have hope. I have a lot of hope about America. Optimism and hope are very different. But I think in some ways we're expressing a similar sense that it doesn't have to be this bad, and it isn't going to continue to be this bad. But I do think that it will take the emergence of genuine political talent that puts before the American public the mess of our contemporary political moment as a set of questions, of sort of coherent questions that will result in something more like a majority party and a minority party. I think Republicans are better situated to be the majority party because generally the party of working class Americans is the majority party in America. But either party could do it with a dash of political talent. And that's a lot of what we haven't seen yet. I think we're at the end of a disordered phase in American politics. An election where both candidates are 80 years old is probably the end of something, not the beginning of something. And I do think that there's reason to see the emergence of a kind of political phase where some of the questions you're raising, Dan, are the organizing questions. But I don't think it's quite right to say that the problem is we simply don't have majorities and minorities. Majorities and minorities are created by questions put to them by politics. I think there's often a way of sort of thinking about elections, for example, as a kind of census of public views. Like people just walk around having an opinion about who should be the governor. And then you ask them in the election and discover what the opinion is. But that can't be right. The system puts certain questions to the public. And those questions form the mass of our population into a public. And the questions are different in different systems, right? In European systems, they ask you, which party do you support? In the American system, they ask you, who should be your senator? Those are very different questions. And I think they form different kinds of publics. And that there's a kind of failure of the party system now and an absence of political talent that has made it difficult for our system to approach the public with coherent questions. I don't think that lasts forever. I don't think we're in a phase that endures. I think this next phase is certainly more populist than the last phase. There's no way around that, and that would be appropriate given the public mood. But I do think that it will not be deadlocked as far as the eye can see.
After Dan responds, we're going to go to audience Q&A. So if you have questions, particularly y'all young editors and writers in the audience, I will be calling on you in just a few minutes here. Dan.
Well, I guess just briefly, I don't believe that a politician, or a set of politicians emphasizing a question is going to really supply the needs of American national coherence. And, you brought up the idea that, well, there are these new social questions and there will be new coalitions formed around them, perhaps a majority coalition. I don't know. The TikTok, case right now would be maybe a test of this. So a couple of observations. The DC policy community hates TikTok. I mean, there actually is a consensus, among Democrats on Capitol Hill, Republicans on Capitol Hill, they'd be very happy. They certainly want to take TikTok away from, its Chinese influences. Again, there's a very broad policy consensus on this. And, I think many of them would like to regulate TikTok, maybe, abolish it, whatever. Donald Trump has taken the side of TikTok and its current, partly Chinese ownership. And that has dramatically changed the politics. So the question is not driving the coalitions. It's rather, the members of the coalition who then are driving the question. Finally, my own, sort of greatest sympathy is with a comment that Walter Kern made on Twitter, or X as it's now called. Walter Kern said, nobody in Middle America is talking about this Twitter nonsense, or this TikTok nonsense, which, okay, maybe he's exaggerating. But the things that are obsessively, fascinating to the policy community in Washington, D.C., are not terribly interesting to a lot of Middle Americans, whereas a lot of the things that ordinary Americans are interested in are things that, elite, policymakers here in Washington, D.C. would dismiss as conspiracy theories or worse. So I think the entropy of our current era is much more serious than perhaps Yuval would say.
The kinds of questions that have organized American politics at different times, the question of the national bank or the regulation of industry, these didn't just, these weren't, they didn't fall from the sky. They were formulated as organizing questions for our politics by exactly this kind of aligning of public concerns with the language of politics. And I guess I ultimately think 19th century America was not a unified society in the way that mid-20th century America was. It was profoundly divided over all kinds of things. It had immigration levels that were higher than ours now. With all of the costs that we're paying for that, they had them too. And there was a need for a kind of politics that can create majorities and minorities by recognizing the questions that raised for the country. I think some of what we're missing now is a function of the absence of that kind of politics. That's not to suggest that I don't think that the loss of the kind of cultural continuity of American life, its connection to its roots in the West and in our religions, is not a huge problem. It is a massive problem. But what do we do about that as a political matter, I think, is a question that our politics is capable of taking up, but has so far failed to take. And to me, I mean, I think a lot of that is connected to what we said before about the inability of the parties to learn that what they're doing isn't working.
Well, but here's a question.
And after Dan responds this time, we will go to audience questions.
I mean, maybe the synthesis of our perspectives here, which I think are still differing, but it would be to say this very question of national identity is the question that's going to create the national majority or not. Because that's the other point, is that, it may well be, if this is the right question, it could be answered in the way conservatives would like to answer it, which is, yes, we're going to recreate some degree of national cohesion. And I take your point. I mean, we both know full well, as do most folks in the room, I think, that America, you can exaggerate the degree to which it has ever been unified, but you can also exaggerate the degree to which, it's been splintered. And you can also look at the ways in which splintering in the past has also been very deadly to Americans, or very dangerous. And I would actually say, I mean, even if you think of the Civil War, in the Civil War, you actually often did have brother fighting brother. You had people who were reading from the same Bible. The divisions were very real. The divisions were absolutely material. They were absolutely deadly. But there was still some idea that, well, okay, there could be some common ground for us to all settle at the end of it, one way or the other. Whereas I think that's less true now. And that, especially if America has to be, if there's a sense in which, America is a microcosm of the entire globe, and the globe is kind of a macrocosm of America, which I would say is, kind of the key, article of faith for what gets called globalism. If that's one's view, I think that's a radically different, picture of America and the world than what one found in the 19th century.
And speaking of all these elite delusions, including my own, I've watched Dan and Yuval moderate a lot of forums and panels just like this one, and I have observed from both of their moderating that one of the best ways to be a good panel host is to get your guests to fight each other depolarizingly. And I am happy that I have at least a little bit succeeded here. So thank you, too, for this. Let's go to questions from the audience. Jesse is going to be passing around the microphone. And anybody who has a question, please raise your hand. Please make sure to keep your question in the form of a question. And the definition of that is it has a question mark at the end. Corey, in the back.
Hi.
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, you can. Okay, I can't hear myself. Okay. I was wondering. I mean, we talked a lot about like populism, but like, I'm very skeptical of this idea that like, quite frankly, we should even care with like 90% of the public things. I mean, like, at the end of the day, like, we live in a country where like, you know, like a large portion of Americans don't know anything besides like, you know, who's playing in like the football game next weekend. Like, I mean, like most people don't really have a good idea of what's going on. And people, for example, when you look at polling will say like people should, I know this has to be a question. Like, for example, when you look at polling, like polling will, for example, say that people don't get, like, for example, if you look at polling, like people say something, but like in the poll what they want, but like they have contradicting views. So like I'm rambling, but like my general question is that how do you think that we can like have a government that kind of like runs on populist politics when the country seems deeply confused about what it actually wants?
Dan, I think that's to you mostly.
Yeah, so you might not, and this I don't mean you as individually you, I mean you in a generic sense. One might not think very highly of the American people, but they do have the vote, and they do get to have a say on public decisions. And I'm actually kind of shocked these days, and again, this is not directed towards this particular question, but there seems to be a general disregard and even disdain, not just in this town, but among elite college students and others, for the idea that other people's lives, you know, are important to them, that they may be factually misguided, they may have the wrong religion, they may be mistaken in one thing or another, but they're not simply going to shut up and do what you tell them to do just because you happen to think that you're smarter than they are and that you've got, you know, the right answers for their lives. Now, the whole reason we have a democratic republic, first of all, it's a republic because a, you know, sort of pure plebiscitary democracy would indeed have problems of public ignorance, you know, perhaps leading to all kinds of extravagances. You know, the classic, you know, political problems of, you know, that Aristotle describes with democracy. So a republic, you know, does try to modulate and limit that somewhat. But it still is a democratic republic, and you still have to take account of the fact that politics is about dealing with other people, people who are not you, people who don't believe the same things you believe, don't have the same interests that you have. Stitching these things together is a work of genius. And it's something that, you know, I mean, every time I reread the Federalist Papers, every time I look again at America's founding documents, I'm impressed by the commitment that our founding fathers had to making this work. And there is unfortunately a myth about the founding fathers, especially on the American right, which says that they were anti-democratic, that you know, they didn't want to have you know, popular, you know, say in things. No, they thought that you had to have a fundamentally popular form of government, but that you could structure it in such a way that the different impulses the people had would be moderated by, you know, different phases, for example, in time. So the fact that the majority of the Senate and the majority of the House are elected at different times, different phases, different election sequences, that means that, you know, if you had a sudden, you know, sort of cultural, you know, fad or enthusiasm among the public in one given moment, you would still have all the people in the Senate who were elected in the past cycles who would not be in part of that same sort of sudden phase. And if it turns out that, you know, Americans are going to continue going wild in terms of some commitment over the course of, you know, a 6-year Senate term and, you know, 3 2-year House terms, well, then so be it. You can't, you know, what are you going to do to stop that if that's the American people are determined to do something wild in that case? But generally, the founding fathers thought, no, if you slow this down, if you create, you know, these opportunities for, you know, dividing and recombining public opinion, you would get the wiser element in public opinion would be filtered out. Not because you had an elite deciding which views were going to be pursued, but because the people themselves have their better element and their worst element, and that you're trying to create systems that will help that better element come through. That, by the way, I think is a fundamental question about our form of government. If you don't think that both the people and the elites, both of them, are mixtures of a better side and a worse side, then you probably shouldn't want to support a democratic republic, or maybe a republic at all, because you're going to say, well, the people are always in the wrong, or the elite is always in the right, and therefore we should simply put power where the competence and the moral virtue lies. Now that there are lots of undergraduates who think this sounds like a wonderful political scheme, but it has no relationship to the reality of the world in which people live. Because first of all, political questions are very complicated. They are also oftentimes indeterminate. Sometimes do you drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road? That is not a question for political philosophy. That's simply a question for a convention. Maybe that convention is going to be settled by an administrator rather than a public vote. But in any case, it's a convention. It's something that you can have. You can debate endlessly because there's no philosophically correct answer to it. So anyway, I would just emphasize that I think we have to, understand what it means to be both a democracy and a republic simultaneously. And I take this point that you can have, the voter ignorance is always astonishing, but voter ignorance has to be weighed against what you've all alluded to, which is intellectual arrogance. The arrogance of the policymaking community is, as dangerous, in some ways more dangerous, than the stupidity of the average voter. By the way, I mean, think about this. I mean, what's more dangerous? Well, actually, they're both quite dangerous. So you could have a peasant who is uneducated, and if that person got political power, their prejudices might run wild. But you also have commissars who are extremely well educated. I mean, think of Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had a brilliant education in France. You have any number of Pol Pot, I think, was also highly educated. You have lots of people who. Well, the French are much more intellectually sophisticated than we are in so many respects, and but that's not always a good thing. So you have to balance. Ignorance is not a good thing, but it also isn't necessarily as bad as corrupted intellect.
I think it's and I think we have to see that the beauty of our constitutional system, and I should say I'm contractually obligated to tell you, I have a book coming out in June that makes this argument for the American Constitution. The beauty of our system is that it doesn't trust the people, and it doesn't trust the elites. It doesn't trust anyone, and it forces everyone to pass a test which looks roughly like empowering the other side. And I think the institutions, the Republican institutions of our system, the representative institutions, are there to filter public attitude, to make sure that public whims don't just have their way and we live in an endless chaos. But they're also there to make sure that broad, durable public views control the direction of American political life. So if the public has a whim, the system's not going to respond to it immediately. But if people 6 years later, 4 years later say, no, we actually need this, the system at a certain point does not have a choice but to do what they say. And I think that is a way to put to the test both the instincts of the public and the views of elites in a way that doesn't trust either one but empowers both. The system looks for a balance between majority rule and minority rights, between majority rule and a kind of elite representation. And it's not perfect. It's sometimes not even very good, but it is better than the alternative. And, I think in a fallen world, that's pretty damn good.
We have further questions from the audience. Robert, Jesse, can you take us in?
Thanks. This has been great. My question's for either of you. Mr. Levin, you mentioned a few times, I think, the need for specifically political talent today. And you also said something about how so many think tanks and so many policy ideas and papers are kind of holdover to develop talent and ideas until we get back in government and can do something. So does this suggest that writing is ultimately impotent, a kind of consolation prize for losers, or People who just don't want to get their hands dirty in politics?
Well, writing
I'd like both of you to take that,
Yeah.
actually.
I think writing can be very influential in a particular way. I think it matters a lot how sentences are finished, and it also matters a lot how people frame for themselves and for the public an understanding of the challenges of the moment, of the character of the time we live in, of the needs of our society. Writing can help all of that happen, but I think we should not mistake writing talent for political talent. Those aren't the same thing. There's room for both. There's need for both. But they're not identical, and they don't often go together. Sometimes they do. Sometimes there's Abraham Lincoln, but not very often. And generally speaking, political writers would not be very good politicians. Just think about the people you know, and it's not hard to arrive at that conclusion. They're still necessary. I still think they do play a very important role in a functional democratic society. There is a need for arguments. There's a need for deepening our sense of things. There's a need for connecting politics with literature and with history and with political philosophy. But we shouldn't underestimate what that is and what that does. But we also shouldn't overestimate how significant, how important it is. So I think what we're missing now, there's not really a shortage of political writers now. I mean, you could always have better ones, but we fill our magazine. What we're missing now is, I think, political talent. Is people who are capable of translating the kind of sense that a good political writer might be able to uncover, but the kind that ultimately really comes from instinct, from living in this society and grasping what it is missing and what it needs, translating that into not only political rhetoric, but political leadership. And in a moment like this, when people are so frustrated, when people are so alienated, that kind of political talent has to give people a stake in the life of our society, has to invest them in the success of our political institutions. And there are just not a lot of people who are doing that well right now. I think there are some here and there, especially governors. Governors are the only sane people in our politics right now, in either party. But there needs to be a lot more for us to get out of this kind of frustrating phase.
Brian is writing for losers.
Oh, I mean, one of the points that you've all made earlier quite clearly was that there's a need to clarify questions. And I think writers generally do that first, and then politicians will. This is actually the opposite of the policy process which you described. So in the policy process, the politician will start the sentence, the policy writer will finish it. But there's also, in setting these grand questions, these narratives, which determine our society, or that lead people to choose one side or another on controversies, it's typically the writers and the creators who start the sentence, and the politician who says, aha, I see a way to finish that sentence in a way that's going to get me elected. So writers are, you need to have both sides of this complementary relationship. So you have the politicians, yes, but you need the writers. And I would say that even right now, we have too many writers who are focused either on small questions or who are narrowly focused on their own communities and their own sort of, majorities of five in their own heads, right? And too few people who are actually like a Robert Nisbet or like some of the great, social thinkers of the 20th century or even the 19th century. And that dearth of, people, and the problem too is it's partly institutional, unfortunately, because, newspapers will not let you go beyond a certain amount of depth in your writing. The academy is, now geared entirely towards specialization. The kind of broad, philosophical thinking of, and these are not necessarily people I admire the most, but Karl Marx or John Stuart Mill, you can't, there is such a person nowadays. I mean, Yuval is actually, reasonably close to being that, but, he would be a much more famous figure if we still had the kind of environment that allowed for social thinking of this, kind of depth and breadth. So you need that. We don't have it. And I think, the entropy that we're suffering is one of the consequences of that.
I think there's and their value in moments like this, in moments when we're trying to make sense of a complicated moment. There used to really be academic generals. It used to make sense for a political scientist to be a generalist, so that you'd have Sam Huntington writing great books in 7 different subgenres of political science. That's totally impossible now. That person would never have a job. And I think we pay a real price for it. And in those areas where the academy has tended to be most useful to the political, like macroeconomics or foreign policy, it is now totally useless to the political. Absolutely useless. Politicians are still running around with macro concepts that were designed to explain the Great Depression. They make no sense for thinking about the country. But there just aren't new ones because economists are asking little tiny college students respond to surveys. And foreign policy and so on. I think it would be very, very hard for them to be useful right now.
Let's go to one last pair of questions. We'll bundle these into one. I'm sorry, you two. These two raise their hands first, and we're almost out of time. But the gentleman in the third row, and then the gentleman up front, please. Thank you, Jesse.
Hi, my name is Andrew Zach. Thank you both for speaking. I'm gonna kind of cheat if that's okay and ask one question for each panelist, if that's okay.
We'll bundle it three ways then.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yuval, my question for you is, you mentioned the, in addition to the left-right axis, you mentioned the insider-outsider axis. And I was wondering if you could speak more on that specifically. Do you think that is something that is a constant feature of American politics, or do you think that's a uniquely modern feature that has manifested in the last 30 to 40 years? And then for Dan, what I take, and correct me if I'm wrong along the way, but what I take your diagnosis of the problem to be is we have this fundamentally disconnected elite class that is kind of running things in DC. We have this real lack of the American public, and then we have these problems with the public in general just not knowing what they want. So my question for you is, what do you think the institutional, or I guess policy solution is to that? And I understand that, whatever, we all have our certain preferred policy priors as to what we would like to have happen on the local and national scale, but I'm curious what you think the way out of that bind is, and what, like, beyond just, I want XYZ policy, it would be great if we had that. What would a reform agenda actually look like to kind of make the situation a little better?
And then to this gentleman up in the front as well, the green shirt.
It's opportune because my question is very similar to this here. By the way, if men were angels, we wouldn't have to do all this,
That's
right?
true. That's true. The wise man says.
What about wise men, right?
That's what Prayer for Angels is working on, but one of these days.
You let somebody who's not a younger writer to okay, good. No, really, simply, both of you touched on something I find quite many things that are interesting, but particularly this notion that this axis is similar in both parties, the axis between the populism and the elitism, which is similar to this next question coming up. What do you see happening about the elitists or the elitism? I'm not exactly sure how you say it, within both parties. What happens is they seem to share most of their interests vis-a-vis, in this case, probably it's beginning to be looking like a more Republican populism, but nevertheless, vis-a-vis the populism. This, I recognize, is something that's not particularly new in politics, but I think it's happening now. I like your comments on that.
The insider-outsider axis is older than the left-right, much older. That it's really the organizing principle of politics, as Aristotle understood it, of the many and the few. Tocqueville called it democracy or aristocracy. Though that way of thinking about the nature of political divisions is in some ways just a more fundamental way to think about what politics is for. What's distinct is what's different, and I wouldn't say now because we've been living it. The 18th century was a long time ago, but what the kind of English-speaking liberal democracies introduced to the world is a politics organized around the question of how should social change happen? Should it be understood as revolutionary and disruptive? Should it be understood as incremental and continuous? A party of progress, a party of conservation. That kind of left-right divide is newer. But I do think that in our sort of politics, we've had for a long time, and really from the beginning, from the Age of Revolution, we've had a politics in which the core division is the left-right divide. The divide between the parties is about how social change happens. And within both parties, there is an elite segment and a populist segment. And I don't think that's new either. What changes over time is which segment dominates each party. And so in a sense, you might say, which is the outsider party and which is the insider party? Is it the left? Is it the right? I think that in my own lifetime, and really in some ways in the 21st century, we've seen the Democrats and Republicans, they're still the left and right. They haven't switched sides, but they have switched sides on the inside or outside. So that
The question being, though, because is what happens, whether you're inside or outside in your particular party, but the insiders in both parties, whether are finding themselves.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that in a sense always happens too. They have some shared interests, but they're still divided along partisan lines, and that divide is really powerful. So I would just say in general, I think Democrats used to understand themselves as the people banging on the windows outside of our institutions, fighting the man, fighting the power. They still wish they were those people, but they're not. They're the people inside the institutions. They are the man. They are the power. Republicans, in some ways, are more at home being in the institutions because the right defends institutions. We want to protect these things. And yet, conservatives, Republicans have come to understand themselves as the outside party in American politics in a very powerful way. The electoral coalitions have shifted in such a way that, generally speaking, the party of the working class is the outside party. And that was the Democrats for a long time. It is now the Republicans, and more so. And so I think you're just going to see a populist party of the right for a while and an elitist party of the left. To me, that's not new. It does shift back and forth. We've seen it shift before.
But any of the elitists on the right.
Some, but not many. Yeah.
This is the subject of a future America's Public Forum, and I will be looking forward to shaping it with these gentlemen up front and many more. Yuval, do you have more thoughts on this, or Dan, would you like to take some?
Well, some of them already have made that shift, though, right? So since Donald Trump came on the scene, you had a few have gone the other way as well, but a number of, formerly very prominent conservative intellectuals, Republican Party office holders, have either shifted all the way to becoming supporters of Joe Biden, or are now basically, sort of anti-Republican, if not necessarily pro-Democrat. And it seems if this continues, if this trajectory goes on for another, 4 or 8 years, that a lot of those people who are halfway right now are going to realign, entirely in the opposite direction. But I think you're right that the, up and down axis is, it's volatile. It's at least as important as the left-right axis, and it's much older and much more fundamental to politics. I will say that regarding the left-right axis, one of the things that both the left and the right had to deal with, the right trying to preserve something from the world, that we inherited from the 18th century and before, the left trying to, bring us to a scientific and ethical, sort of liberation from precisely the chains of history that we had inherited. That's the left-right spectrum right there. And both the left and the right had to deal with a phenomenon which got underway significantly, at least in the 18th century, really, continued to grow vastly in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that may now actually be at an end. And this is the rise of the masses. It is industrialization, the concentration of formerly agrarian populations into cities, combined with vast population growth within the cities. This takes place internally in a number of places, in Britain, for example, in the Netherlands. But it also, of course, it becomes a worldwide revolution, which has implications for policy, all sorts of other things, and also the balance of civilizational power between Europe, on the one hand, which starts out, has a very booming population. It has, high technology, and many of the populations in other parts of the world that they encounter, populations already, or that of disease, for example, logical, differential is significant in terms of creating a power differential. But a lot of that is being evened out and eroded or ended today, and that's a natural process, perhaps certainly an inevitable process. I can't see anything that would stop that. And now, of course, the one of the fundamental conditions of the rise of the masses, which is a growing population, is no longer a phenomenon that is intrinsic to advanced industrial societies, whether we're talking about China or Japan or South Korea or Europe or America. All of them are below replacement levels in terms of their current population base. Even the places which previously were sources of replenishment for those populations are starting to have lower and lower population growth rates. So there's the population of the world as a whole will continue to grow for a couple of decades still, but it's slowing down. And when that changes, you're actually going to have I think, a drastic shift in terms of politics, because again, both left and right have lived in the shadow of the rise of the masses, for the last 200 plus years. And if the masses dissolve, which is not just or population growth rates, but is also a matter of fragmentation, that have less and less the sense that their geographic location determines who they are, and more sense that other identities are now more salient. You're going to have the left-right spectrum will probably be scrapped by that and replaced with maybe a different kind of left-right spectrum. But it's a massive change that's coming. Now, on the question about what kind of policy is to be pursued here, I would like to see both parties, Republicans and Democrats, both progressives and conservatives and libertarians, all, and maybe this is a nice, braver angels note on which to end, but I'd like to see them all, kind of look to the past and say, okay, here were the things that we used to endorse, as Americans, and that we should re-emphasize those things. There were always divisions, of course, and even some of the things where there were consensuses upon were actually bad things. So obviously you're not just resurrecting all of the old consensuses, but you certainly, I think everyone should be aware that the danger we're all facing right now on the left and on the right among libertarians and others is entropy. It's not, a sense that we're too encumbered by the things that bring us together or that give us, a common, not just a common ideology or a common, sort of set of, ideas, but simply a sense of being part of a common community. And if you don't have that, then anything else political is going to fail. I may disagree a little bit with Yuval in that, I just have less confidence that a political genius can create that kind of polity when the polity itself has dissolved into socially atomized conditions. So trying to restore those meta-narratives, which were very unfashionable in the 1980s and are still unfashionable now, they're being torn to shreds by TikTok and by distractions on our iPhones. Restoring those meta-narratives is essential, even though we're not all going to agree, but we can at least start to have a little bit more language in common upon which to have a debate.
As a right-wing magazine junkie myself, one of my favorite things about running these sorts of events is taking readers or writers whose writing I enjoy reading and having them say things and extrapolate on things that I'm sure I will see them be writing in print sooner or later here. So Dan and Yuval, I came into this event hoping to glean a couple of insights with you and with our audience on ways that the American rights deliberations inside itself can help with the deliberative process in America in general. And I think you two both have helped us think a little bit more clearly on all of that. So thank you for this. And on behalf of the Braver Angels national community, I, for one, and I think there's a lot of people watching this right here, right now, would be quite interested in seeing you guys here in Braver Angels a little bit more frequently. So we will be sure to invite you to various things. We're going to get closed out now in just a few minutes, but I want to thank the Hertog Foundation for opening their venue to us very generously. There's a couple of Hertog alums in the audience, and there's others who may well someday soon become Hertog alums. Just so you all know, the Hertog Foundation is running a couple interesting summer programs, some of them alumni specific, a couple open to the general young professional community. Some of which are focusing on themes strangely close to the ones that we talked about now. So I highly recommend applying to those if anybody is interested there. And then additionally, for those of you who are interested in seeing just precisely what these conservative intellectual communities that Dan and Yuval have been telling us about for the last 2 hours are thinking about, there are copies of National Affairs and Modern Age on the left side and right side of the table in the very back, respectively. That has nothing to do with where they are on the spectrum of the right. So I highly encourage you to go get those and also take a look at their websites and consider subscribing. These are two of the most routinely worth reading journals in American conservatism right nowadays, and I think they will continue to be for quite some time to come. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us, and let me give you all the final spiel. We will have a reception going on with cheese and crackers in the side. Braver Angels is the nation's largest grassroots-led, fully red-blue citizens movement to help Americans of every background find value in each other across all our political, social, and cultural divides. We work to hold America together in times of trial by practicing goodwill ourselves and inviting all our fellow Americans to come in too. We do this through a variety of workshops, debates, trainings, and gatherings at every level of society and excluding no one. If you'd like to be involved in this, please come find me or Jesse later on in this event, and we'll talk to you about it more there. If you want a humbler, kindler, more charitable, more honest American political culture and are willing to start with yourself, then we at Braver Angels are the place for you. We are always looking for volunteers and partners, and we can promise you with certainty that whatever happens in politics, we'll be doing the same work always. Let us all go forth to bind up the nation's wounds and build a house united. Thanks for coming out, everyone, and I'll see you at the next America's Public Forum.